everyone. We'll give a few more minutes for people to join, but I'll just go ahead and start with a little intro. My name is Debbie Churgai. I'm the Interim Director for Americans for Safe Access. If you're not familiar, what Americans for Safe Access, or ASA as we're also known, is, it's a patient advocacy group for medical cannabis. Our mission is to ensure safe and legal access to medical cannabis for patients, for therapeutic use and research. We started out in 2002. Our founder, Steph Shear, created ASA when she realized that there wasn't an option for patients to find safe and legal access to cannabis. So we've been around for, I think it's 18 years now, or 17 years. We've worked our way across the country. We started out in California, helping to change laws. Now we're working also helping to change regulations, to get those regulations to match what patients need. Our goal is really to just make these programs really benefit patients in the best way possible. I want to thank anyone who's on who was here last week. I'm so sorry about the technical difficulties. And thank you so much for joining us again this week. We will be posting this on YouTube for those that couldn't join again this week, and for anyone else who would like to view this. So let's see. The webinar we're going to talk about today is Cascade of Care. I first met Dr. Macalino a few months ago, maybe about 9 months ago now. She reached out to talk about working with ASA on some research topics, and we quickly figured out that we have this love of public health and research, and kind of trying to figure out, where the gaps in knowledge are for patients. And so we came up with this model. We're gonna have about 45 minutes for the webinar, and then at the end, we're gonna do about 15 minutes of Q&A. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you can see something that says Q&A. If you have a question that you don't really want anyone else to see, feel free to type in the question in that box. You can also use the chat to type in a question for other people to see. Feel free to chat as well about other things if you have questions or comments as we're going, and then we'll get to those at the end. And so I would just like to take this over to Grace to start the program.
Great. And just hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining, and really for dealing with our, having your patience with our technical issues last week. Just a little plug for our webinar series. So the idea is today, or what was supposed to be last week, really providing an overview and discussion about what the Cascade of Care is, and then taking the last 15 minutes to do Q&A. And then we're gonna have a follow-up webinar, Cascade of Care, really taking in and getting your perspectives and thoughts, ideas, where and how we can really help flesh out exactly what this could look like moving forward. So that is going to be, and I have it on my last slide, a follow-up webinar, same time, same bat channel, next week. So that's May 16th at 2 o'clock Eastern Standard. Okay, so let me get to my slides. Hold on, I share screen. Oh, I love it, technology is working. Okay, awesome. So I hope you guys can see my screen. Let me see. So I did not know this, but if you want to move the little box that has my face or people's faces, feel free. You can lift the, if you put your arrow on it, you can move the box down and move it out of the way to see the slides. Okay, so as Debbie mentioned, this is a webinar on creating a cascade of care model for medical cannabis. I'm going to share with you what it is and how it can help us think about patient access. Oops. So my promise to you is at the end of the webinar, you will have learned about the cascade of care. You will definitely find value from our time together. Very much looking forward to connecting with each and every one of you when we get a chance later in the Q&A. And that you will also see that you have something to contribute to this conversation for sure. A little bit of housekeeping. I know we have a lot of things that demand our attention, but if you can bring your full undivided attention to this time together, I think it would make a really big difference, both for me as well as for you and the time that you're providing to give to me about the presentation. As Debbie mentioned, it's 45 minutes long. We are gonna set aside for sure 15 minutes of Q&A. Please feel free to share your thoughts and questions in the chat, and Debbie even outlined how you can do it sort of just quietly if you want to, just her and I directly in the Q&A box. And then I'd mentioned how the second webinar will be really to focus on folks' contributions and perspectives on stuff we're talking about today. So as far as why the cascade of care for medical cannabis access and why now? And I really think the why there for me is in our discussions with Debbie and folks at ACE is really, it really is time to get organized and bring evidence-based resources to truly give strength to a legitimate medical treatment for patients and give it that legitimacy it deserves. Why me specifically? I am, a little bit about me, I am the daughter of two medical doctors from the Philippines. That was supposed to be my path. I was an immigrant child and was smart and good at school. And then something happened in the late 80s. My uncle died of HIV AIDS in 1987. And that really did sort of change my life forever. I was drawn to do public health and do work that, hey, instead of changing the lives of one person at a time doing medicine, if there was a possibility for me to change the lives of thousands or many people, even if I didn't ever get to meet them, then that was important to me. And really giving voice to those that didn't have one, giving perspectives to people who, couldn't provide that, and really bringing light and knowledge to people who really needed it. It's been an incredible career since then. I've had the opportunity to do research in a number of settings, both in academia at Brown and at Tufts. I've worked in nonprofit at the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health. I've provided health promotion in non-traditional settings like beauty salons or barbershops, focused on health disparities and marginalized populations, and then most recently worked with the Department of Defense, really focusing on prevention efforts for HIV and sexually transmitted diseases for active duty members. The reason why I really see the cascade of care being important, and sort of I'll get to where and how my life sort of led to medical cannabis and connecting with Debbie and folks at ASA, is really seeing how this cascade of care can bring clarity to the field, really provide a good roadmap. And as I mentioned before, not just in theory, but that you will actually find something relevant to the work you're doing right now. And that's sort of where the what's in it for you phrase came from. So, there are lots and lots and lots of issues right now impacting medical cannabis, anything from support and kind of what helps getting folks access, and what stands in the ways, how do providers interact with the whole thing, how does recreational potentially impact medical access, knowledge, and racial disparities, etc. But it's a lot going on, and very, very early on, it's easy to kind of get lost in the morass of all kinds of different issues going on. And I really like this quote, as Albert Einstein said, if you can't explain it simply, you don't understand it well enough. So really the idea of how do we kind of focus things in a way that has things be really simple, and folks that are kind of new to the field really know where to find themselves. So a little bit about our research model, our framework, and what it should do, and why, we're doing good work. Why do we need it? Why should you be thinking about it? A model really does enhance understanding of the representative system. It promotes efficient explaining of a system and between different stakeholders and where and how people can fit in. It provides a point of reference for stakeholders to gather model specifications in terms of understanding kind of like where are we now and where do we need to be going. And then finally, it documents current models for future reference. It gives us a way to sort of think about where are we now and where do we need to be going. So some advantages of having like a conceptual model or a research framework is it doesn't establish really specific entities. There's no surprises. It accounts for a lot of sort of the background noise in terms of what's going on in the field. For example, all of a sudden recreational use of cannabis can be put in a framework with how does that impact medical cannabis access, as opposed to it sort of taking the forefront of the discussion. It can define a project scope in terms of thinking about what are the true issues, what's most important to us as we think about medical cannabis access. It can provide a base model for other models, and I'll show you in a little bit sort of how we're thinking about that right now as we think about specific unique populations and their unique needs and issues, really providing a jumping off point for other ways of looking at something. And what I really love is it really does provide a high level understanding. It gives you a chance to really see how so many complex issues sort of come together in this really nice sort of succinct way, and makes it easy to explain to someone who isn't in the weeds with the issues on a regular basis. So why is it important to create a model for medical cannabis care? Some of the things that we thought of, and this is definitely not unique to what I have here on this slide, but it provides an organizing framework for resources, collaboration, and knowledge. I gotta move my little, shared knowledge, there you go. It provides legitimacy and credibility as a clinical healthcare population and drug. Many other, and you'll see in a little bit, disease conditions actually have or think about, care in this cascade of care way. And then it helps guide and target interventions where it's needed most, right? It gives you, once you have that roadmap, you know where you're going, you have a sense of okay, well, what are the steps that are gonna take me from where I am to where I need to go? Okay, so as I mentioned, I spent a lot of my early career focused on HIV and AIDS in the early years, or earlier years. I saw a lot of similarities between the work I did in HIV and some of the early days of medical cannabis, for sure. I think that the stigma around it, lots and lots of concerns, lots of preconceived notions about populations being impacted with HIV, sort of, how it's being transmitted, and prevention efforts were really shaped by those early misconceptions. And I think a lot of what we see as far as medical cannabis is getting shaped by a lot of preconceived notions about cannabis in general, how, the fact that it's still a Schedule I drug, how people see it really does impact now patients that are looking to access medical cannabis, even if their use of cannabis is very, very different from, how cannabis has been seen in the past. So there's definitely lots of similarities in that way. There's also, when HIV first came out, it was such a huge change in the way we thought about science and research in general. And I think even medical cannabis as a field is such a unique, different way of thinking about sort of what it was once before. It's not like Tylenol or, allergy meds had a past perspective on it the way medical cannabis does. So again, lots of similarities that, I saw in both the field evolving as well as the way people have thought about it over time. So there's something that came out in the early 2000s in HIV called the HIV Care Continuum that really did set the stage for how Debbie and folks at ASA and I really thought through, coming up with this cascade of care model for medical cannabis. And the HIV Care Continuum is actually quite simple. It really does just focus on, if the goal is to get as many people on very strong HIV antiretroviral therapy meds, there are a number of steps that someone has to get through to get there. And that actually starts with, you have to be diagnosed, right? So that's the first hexagon. Then you have to be linked to care, right? You have to be able to be prescribed care and engaged and retained in care. You have to be prescribed antiretroviral meds. And then ultimately, once you're prescribed, you also have to stay adherent to your medications so you achieve viral suppression, right? And that actually doesn't just impact that person, that impacts folks. You're less likely to transmit HIV, it really makes a huge difference. That's why that's such a goal. Okay. So here's an example of what the HIV Cascade of Care actual graph would look like. So if persons living with HIV, that's the far left bar, represents 100%. You can see that as, the phases, as you go down the phases, folks do drop off. So only 79%, as in 2011, of folks are HIV diagnosed. 59% are linked to HIV care. And then you can actually see finally down here at the end, let's see if you guys can see my arrow, at the far right bar, right, only 19% of all the folks living with HIV are actually virologically suppressed. So you can see that not only is there a lot of work to do, you get a sense of like where along the pathway is there, work to be done to actually identify opportunities for change, right? So folks need to be more diagnosed, get more access to care, be retained in care, etc. So you can see how that actually, I love this graph. I think it does a really nice job of showing kind of like where you get good information. So the Medical Cannabis Cascade of Care model is similar. We thought it was just easier to kind of collapse it down into 4 stages. Stage 1 is diagnosis, and I'm going to get into more specifics of each one of these stages. Stage 2 would be linkage to care. Stage 3 would be receipt of drug, and stage 4 would be appropriate care. Okay, so let's see. So within diagnosis, right, I tried to come up with a nice visual that would really show kind of what's going on here. So yes, there are some folks that are diagnosed, and to me that represents the kind of orange triangle of the pie. But there's this big blue sort of undiagnosed, or sort of not, kind of they're already cut off from this very first phase because, medical cannabis is still illegal in their states, or even though that state has legalized it, it's slow uptake in terms of getting their system started. There's restrictive approved diagnoses. So there are some states that have very, very strict definitions of who gets access to medical cannabis, or what conditions, or it has to be sort of the last ditch effort, treatment as opposed to, first and foremost. And then a lack of knowledge on the part of either providers, not knowing that medical cannabis is a viable treatment, or patients not knowing that either their condition might benefit from medical cannabis, or that medical cannabis is even something that exists for them. Oops. Okay, opportunities or issues to address focused in this stage includes inconsistent and/or restrictive eligibility criteria, and conditions by state, lack of knowledge regarding the proportions within reasons for lack of access. So we don't really know, like, how does the lack of access break down in this specific phase. What's lacking or an opportunity here, evidence-based education and training for both providers and patients, and provider fear regarding cannabis prescription and licensing, like not really knowing, like, how does that work? Like, do I have to worry about my medical license if I even mention it or bring it up? So again, lots and lots of opportunities here. Because at the end of the day, it's always important to focus that these are patients, real people that we're talking about that aren't getting access to meds. We thought for each one of these stages, we focused on specific patient insights. And this is from a survey that ASA had gathered, just an open-ended question regarding, access. And so here are some quotes. I won't read them, all of them, but here are some quotes from patients that are focused on diagnosis specifically. They live in a state that, quote, only medical legal is available in the narrowest sense of the term, right? I'd like to see physicians get better training or set up a system for assessing valid recommendations. So again, this is real struggles and issues and barriers that folks have to even just getting diagnosed in the first place. So as far as linkage to care, so again, there goes our little pie on the left, the orange, where folks are getting linked to medical cannabis care. But then there's this whole other piece that folks are kind of left out from that pie. There are few or not enough eligible prescribing providers. There's no standard of care for medical consultation. Exactly what does that look like? And barriers to visiting a prescribing provider. Anything from fear to cost, the cost of actually getting a prescription, not having insurance coverage. Opportunities to address, tried to group these by, policy, so few caregiver, advocate, or other community resources out there, slow implementation of state medical cannabis programs, and prohibitive laws around medical cannabis access for those with a prior record. So for a long, long time, if you, had cannabis possession, you were thrown into prison, or definitely at least jail in some settings. So the fact that now those folks no longer have access to medical cannabis, has yet to be addressed for sure. As far as support, there are few caregiver, advocate, or other community resources. And as far as education and training, few evidence-based resources linking conditions and treatment options. And then health disparities in terms of who are actually referred and or those that are actually prescribed meds. So here are some specific insights from folks, that, they really struggle in terms of actual linkage to care. The high cost of doctors who are willing to recommend, where it costs over $500 in cash to not just get the initial prescription, but every 3 months thereafter, requiring some funding. Okay, so now we're at stage 3. So let's say you've made it through stage 1 and stage 2, and now here. So the actual receipt of medical cannabis, like what could get in the way. And I changed this up a little bit so we're not always seeing the same things, but some gaps that one could think about. And these lists are definitely by no means exhaustive, but could include few licensed facilities and or dispensaries, right? Limited and inconsistent product availability. Prohibitive cost, again, lack of insurance coverage. Dispensaries not located in, so like for example, CVS does a great job probably in sort of working through exactly how do they locate themselves in, equally in all neighborhoods. But, that might not be the case as dispensaries are popping up based on, different issues. Like, are they not located in, not in diverse or people of color neighborhoods and communities? Negative patient experiences, anywhere from, trying to find a dispensary to their actual interface when they're in a dispensary. We've heard many, many different anecdotal stories about how their interaction at the dispensary is not what they expected or wanted if they were thinking about it purely from a medical cannabis way. Opportunities or issues to address can include, addressing fears related to legal status, and I'd mentioned this, including prior experience with law enforcement, a lack of civil protections, anywhere from concerns about public housing, child welfare and employment concerns, and as I mentioned before, health disparities, how this might differ in terms of receipt of medical cannabis by race or gender, etc. So here are some, patient insights, directly from their words. One challenge is the lack of medical strains. All the stores out there are recreational stores, not necessarily what I'm looking for in terms of folks maybe being older or not having experience, right? And then stage 4, we call appropriate care, really like maintenance and kind of like what does that look like over time, right? So there are still to date few evidence-based resources that really understand sort of treatment and follow-up regimens. Few providers are really knowledgeable about ongoing care needs and what that looks like. There are no standards of care at dispensaries, and as I mentioned, sort of negative patient experience or inconsistent patient experiences in terms of when they go on a regular basis. A lack of regulatory clarity on new and novel modes of administration, such as inhalers or suppositories. More and more of these new modes of delivery and new strains and strengths are coming out without a lot of standardization or really anything being regulated. And then a lack of patient data and research coordination. So an ability to really understand kind of like what does that look like over time by patient for, patient populations. Opportunities and issues to address include a lack of ongoing care and monitoring, the inappropriate use of cannabis, numbers of patients seen regularly over time by state, really understanding like what does that look like in terms of maintenance. And then the impact of recreational cannabis on medical cannabis access, right? How does that change? How does the long-term access for a patient that's been on medical cannabis change once recreational cannabis occurs in a state? Okay, and here are a couple of patient insight quotes. Specifically, the staff at stores seem to assume that I buy cannabis for recreational purposes more often than not, making it harder to get what I need, right? Folks not getting the support that they need as far as the information that they want. And like, how does this interact with the other drugs that I'm taking perhaps, right? So you can see that the medical cannabis cascade of care looks very different from the HIV one with, basically question marks across the board for each one of those stages. What we do know is that significant gaps in knowledge and access exists as far as a cascade of care goes. Data are definitely urgently needed, and we are unable to actually build a cascade of care graph because, for patient estimates at each stage. Now, doing a little bit more of a deep dive, like how the cascade of care can help your specific community. You can imagine building a specific cascade of care graph for a specific or unique patient population. That could be, and these are examples for sure. Veterans, opioid addicted individuals, the elderly, condition-specific graphs, right? Folks with MS, Parkinson's, chronic pain, epilepsy, etc. Really giving you the opportunity to highlight unique knowledge and access gaps. And that gives us the opportunity to remove, when I say potential masking, like you could imagine that if you took one big cascade of care graph, and let's say the veterans were, doing better in terms of one phase, but it was really overshadowing or kind of masking what's going on for folks with chronic pain, you wouldn't really see that. But if you're able to sort of tease apart and develop your own sort of cascade of care image to really understand what are your specific issues, that really gives you a lot of power and a lot of ability to focus on your issues. It also gives you, sort of a next cut of that. It gives you a chance to address health disparities head on, right? You can look at graphs overall by gender, by race, by criminal record, by age. It's kind of like where and how are these impacting different populations specifically? And you can see, you can do that by specific condition and gender, by specific condition and race. It just gives you, again, a really nice graphic, powerful way to sort of look and think about the data and information and reflect that to others. So what we did, to give you some data to sort of back this up or sort of start thinking about this, we looked at all existing documented medical cannabis users across the United States. And as part of this sort of sample with existing data, it was like over 1 million individuals. 41 conditions were listed. And I listed out here on this slide the top conditions that were above 1%, okay? The largest group was chronic pain or intractable pain, chronic pain. And then you can see down the list, muscle spasms, nausea, cancer. And then I thought it was important to just include 2+ conditions. Obviously, some folks, or many of these folks might have multiple things going on, but at least those who actually recorded that as their reason for taking medical cannabis, 1.3% of those said 2+ conditions. So I went ahead and just to give you an example of the cascade of care gaps by specific conditions, I looked up, so for chronic or intractable pain, sort of like what are our estimated numbers of folks with that condition, PTSD, anxiety, just to give us sort of like a broad swath. And not surprising, we're really not, we're just hitting the tip of the iceberg in terms of folks that are, getting access to medical cannabis. Estimated numbers of folks with chronic pain are in the 100 million. So at best, we're doing, 0.06% of folks that have chronic intractable pain are on medical cannabis. Say 0.02% of folks are, with PTSD are getting access, and 0.03% of folks with anxiety. Now you could say to me, Grace, okay, well, fine, not every single person that have PTSD needs or might be eligible or, medical cannabis would impact. So, okay, that's great, I'll give you that. But the fact that we're so low and we have so little appreciation for who and what are those kinds of folks that need to be, that where access would make a difference. I mean, we definitely have some work to do and a lot of ground to make for sure to meet up to the people who actually could most use medical cannabis and where it would make a difference for them in their life. So you can see all of a sudden now, medical cannabis cascade of care, sort of like where, how diagnosis and linkage to care, receipt of drug and appropriate care, like where would these drop-offs be from medical cannabis? You can start, at least with issues, sort of filling in the gaps. Where and how are folks dropping off in terms of not getting access, right? With this far left bar representing 100% of folks that could benefit from medical cannabis getting access. So just to take a 2-minute pause, I guess, there really is a place for everyone in, this cascade of care. I have sort of brought and shared a good number of like perspectives related to sort of this phase approach to thinking about access, medical cannabis access. Here I have, again, a sort of a visual, I'm a visual person, representation of the medical cannabis cascade of care, sort of where people can kind of locate themselves. And this is definitely just an example, but you can see where at the bottom I have, addressing discrimination and stigma and disparities across the entire cascade will be important. Research, education, and training really has a place to impact for sure across this cascade of care as well. But I focus, like in diagnosis, policy could really, have an important voice in terms of, getting states that still don't have medical cannabis access, in place. You can see policy and regulatory being really important in sort of this linkage to care. Labs and dispensary, related concerns and delivery focused on sort of the receipt of the drug. And then, delivery, labs, dispensary, growers, in terms of appropriate care, regular product, sort of standardization of product, things like that being important in terms of what does that long-term care look like. And then in the far right, I have a, like a description of sort of like, here are a good few number of sort of stakeholders, right? Anything from, sorry, I have to move my little picture. Researchers, patients, advocates, providers, policymakers, labs, businesses, growers, anyone, any stakeholder that basically has an interest and sees how an important medical cannabis is could really find themselves in this medical cascade of care, and can sort of orient yourself to where and how the work you do can make the biggest difference for folks getting access to medical cannabis. So the cascade of care model as a context for medical cannabis, as I mentioned, I think is easy to understand, but also has many benefits. It can guide funding, it can target interventions, it can identify specific patient population experiences for sure. The model leverages existing knowledge and moves the field forward in a timely and effective manner. My sense is, it's great, it's perfect timing actually to really start thinking in this way, to start having, as NIH funding is starting to hit, as people are starting to really think about like where and how can we make sure that folks that need access to medical cannabis the most are getting it. This provides a very nice, succinct opportunity to get people involved where and how they can. And then the power of developing individual cascade of care narratives for specific conditions. And then, as I mentioned, health disparities concerns, really making sure we tease apart how do those, what does that cascade of care experience look like depending on, who you are and what you look like. What research needs to happen next? I think a lot of qualitative data, there's just a wealth of information that would be valuable for sure. So really understanding what are patients' experiences at each one of these phases, right? Building partnerships with unique populations, folks that have expertise and really understand sort of the chronic pain narrative, folks with mental health, people with Alzheimer's, et cetera. Quantifying the patient experience, as I mentioned, would sort of be the next thing to do once you've gathered all this information, really sort of describing and seeing sort of like how often and, to who, how many people did that actually really impact in that way. Developing targeted interventions that is focused and direct and, makes a great use of money so that, we're not wasting resources if it's not needed there. And then targeted grant funding at every stage. And how can you participate? So in research for sure, patients, we want and need your stories. As I mentioned, our follow-up webinar will be really focused on getting your perspectives and your thoughts, but really getting perspectives from everyone I think is really important. Providers, businesses, each one, as I had mentioned on that slide, that interacts with the cascade, with the medical cannabis industry really does have a voice in all of this for sure. Donating funding, I think moving this forward, hopefully folks can start to get that, like the more we understand about this cascade of care, the further along it'll move the field and get access for medical cannabis to folks who need it. So there's still a world of people who really aren't getting access that really does represent, large populations. Funding research, fundraising with us, and then working with us to identify how the cascade of care applies to your specific group or organization. So let's see. Oh, good. I'm a little early. Awesome. I definitely wanted to make sure that you guys share your stories, challenges, and insights with me. Great kind of spending this time with you, and really, really looking forward to being able to kind of interact and hear some of your perspectives and thoughts. But as I mentioned, we will have a follow-up Cascade of Care Perspectives webinar focused primarily on your input and thoughts that we will both gather ahead of time or maybe take during the, Debbie and I need to sort of work through exactly how that all is going to look, but definitely next week, May 16th at 2 p.m. And very much looking forward to your insights for sure. So I think now I can not stop sharing, right? Is that what
Do you want to talk? Yeah, let's, we have a few questions and comments.
Okay, great.
I'm an RN working for a dispensary in Florida. I find an enormous gap in care in the senior population that reside in care facilities. My initiative is to bridge that gap with the goal of reducing polypharmacy and improving quality of life for the deserving population.
Yeah, I think that, people tend to forget that medical cannabis really does impact so many different populations. And I think importantly, populations that folks have a lot of both respect and interest in wanting to impact. So thank you, it's Stephanie, right? Thank you, Stephanie, for your comment. And I think the more people hear that I think this impacts, senior populations and elderly folks, it always surprises me when I talk to people about medical cannabis and like their first reaction, depending on like where they live with the discussion, is like, oh, are you talking about just stuff for drug users or potheads or, whatever kind of misconceptions they have. But I think people realizing we're talking about, everyone, right? Seniors, children, etc. So thank you.
Seniors is a very important population in this, are pharmacists involved in the cascade of care?
Oh, I would imagine so. Sure. No, and I think that's a great question. And pharmacists are near and dear to my heart because some early work that I did in HIV, we work very closely with pharmacists in terms of getting access to injection drug users with clean syringes, actually. Yes, very much so. I think if we think about medical cannabis very similarly to any other drug, there's lots and lots of reasons why pharmacists need to be included. One, I say they're oftentimes the most underappreciated sort of public health worker because, pharmacists are really on the front lines, working with folks on a regular basis, talking to them about their meds and, what they're doing and what they're up to. So I think even just from a community perspective and how they're involved with folks in their medical sort of healthcare needs, I think is super important. I think that my goal, or as we see this evolve and having medical cannabis be just one of many drugs that folks are taking, hopefully, as we all know, better than others, right? Drugs that they're taking to take care of, what bothers them. I think pharmacists really understanding, potential side effects, like how does it interact with their other meds, really being that educational arm as well to talk to folks like, have you even thought of or heard about medical cannabis? So I definitely see that. I mean, Debbie, what do you think? Are you finding, I'm sure you've seen pharmacists playing a huge role sometimes in how folks think or see medical cannabis.
Yes, definitely. Medical professionals in general, pharmacists specifically, we want as many people to understand medical cannabis and how it works and to talk to their patients. And we definitely want more pharmacists involved. So, a lot of pharmacists are becoming dispensary medical directors and things like that. And it's great to have people with that kind of background, but nurses as well are also amazing. And nurse education is just as important as medical professional education. So,
and I think depending on the community, what would be cool within the cascade of care, like health-seeking behaviors, understanding where do people get their information, and that might be different by different populations. On my slide, when I talk specifically about age, I think age and race, I think we'd be really surprised how folks access care, learn about things. It could be in different channels. it could be from different people. And I would imagine pharmacists play a very big role in some communities where, hey, that's their closest connection to healthcare many times, like, have you heard about this? Tell me a little bit about this. What do you think? So yeah, thanks for that question.
Someone asked, and hello to this person, does a list, I won't say your name since you wrote it privately, but hello, I'm glad you joined us. Does a list of medical professionals with robust experience in treating with medical cannabis exist? In my experience, just because a doctor is prescribing, or we'll say recommending here, does not translate to actually being knowledgeable in treating specific health conditions. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't think there is a list that exists. Unfortunately,
we tried to find, and there is not one.
I think what we did was didn't we create a list of requirements, yep. State by state requirements for doctors to recommend, and not every state has requirements, which is interesting, or requires training or education at all. So, but this would be great to have a list of medical professionals with this kind of experience. Actually, we are actually kind of working on this at ASA through our Cannabis Care certification program. It is just about to get back up. It is a program for health professionals and patients to learn more about medical cannabis. Specifically, medical professionals can get CME credits, which is continuing medical education credits. And once they take that, we're going to start this list of medical professionals, and that includes nurses, nurse practitioners, psychologists, I think even dentists, pharmacists. We're going to start a list of doctors that have taken this education, so people can reach out to us. And if they're looking for a doctor in their area who has been educated on it, then we can help you. I'll put that link up. Let's see. I am working in research for PTSD and medical cannabis, and also want to research the effects on mild brain trauma injury.
Yeah, it's great. So first of all, thank you for the work you do working with, you mentioned veterans. So I think that it's amazing how wide open, there is, and lots of questions and issues to handle and deal with. So thank you for the work. Was there a question there? I'm sorry.
Not really, but it's good.
Okay, good. I missed something that I didn't answer. No, I think that, yeah. And maybe the one thing I want to say is, the advantage of a cascade of care and focusing specifically on like how folks with PTSD might differ in terms of their, like level of, you can imagine maybe diagnosis is easy, right? But they really struggle with getting connected into care because of the things that has PTSD, trouble them in the first place or something. So yeah, thank you for the work you do. And I would imagine it would help really work through, like, what are the issues and at what stages are folks getting stuck?
Actually, there's two different questions, but I want to answer them in kind of a similar way. Someone asked, where is the best place to start? Someone asked, there needs to be a standard training for medical bud tenders besides the basic stuff. Mm-hmm. Most do not know anything. That's true. But then someone else also wrote, it would be nice to see a good housekeeping seal of approval for dispensaries as well. This would allow patients to feel confident in choosing where to purchase their medicine. So if you don't know, we have a program called Patient Focused Certification. It's a third-party certification program that dispensaries, manufacturers, laboratories, cultivators can get certified and have this seal to let patients know that we have that they are selling safe medicine, and what is on their label is actually what's in the medicine. We have several companies that have been certified. I'll post the link where you can find those companies. And there are standards. We worked with the American Herbal Products Association to create these standards. They've been adopted in 19 states. So there are these standards. Thank you for asking this question, because a lot of people actually don't know this. And there are these certifications, but a lot of companies just don't want to sign up for it. Why? because they don't have to. It's not required.
Mm-hmm.
So, but definitely as a patient, you should go into dispensary and ask, is your company PFC certified? And that is the only way you can really guarantee that what they sell or what they're providing has been third-party certified and is safe. I'll put that up. And we also have training programs too. So part of that is also training. We want to guarantee that all the people that have work in the business have been trained, and they've been trained the same way.
Yep.
So we have a training program, which also includes, we call it staff training. We don't call it bud tender training, but that's part of it. And our training basically teaches people how to safely and compliantly work in a medical cannabis business. And we specifically, especially when it comes to dispensaries, we talk about how to talk to patients, because you're not just selling product,
right?
You're dealing with sick patients. And so that's really important.
And I guess I just want to add to that. So, and what's neat, you know, here is, and it's patients in a very unique setting, right? So there's understanding kind of like, what are the struggles that they have to deal with in terms of saying yes to medical cannabis, right? It's not, like I said, that there are things that are unique to medical cannabis that, you know, don't apply to Advil or allergy meds or whatever. So I think, you know, partnering with ASA, working with folks that really understand the unique challenges of patients in medical cannabis, I think is really important, because there's a lot that we need to understand more of. So it's great.
Let's see. Where is the best place to start or find or even build data? It's a good question.
No, it's a great question. Well, definitely reach out to us. Debbie and I have definitely been starting to talk very seriously about what exactly, you know, that data platform would look like, really thinking very carefully about the kinds of things that we need to be collecting. I think really thinking about medical cannabis like it is any other, you know, drug, and starting to compile and understand perspectives from that, coming from there. So that's really sort of, yeah, definitely reach out to us. We have ideas and thoughts for sure.
Let's see. Oh, in answer to the question about qualified medical professionals, there are 3 organizations that have such lists: AACM, CSS, and DFCR. And I'm assuming that means those organizations have lists of medical professionals that have been trained or educated in medical cannabis specifically. That would be interesting to take a look at. Let's see. Jason, I saw
that link. That's awesome. Or we can look that up too and share.
Oh, yeah. Jason, I saw your comment, Jason Barker. It's amazing. I want to talk to you about that a little bit later. Jason came up with maybe like a kind of a way to help get medical professionals, let them, more medical professional knows that they can recommend medical cannabis.
Very much so.
First thing they need to do, of course, is to become a certified doctor.
Yeah, and I think, you know, training and education is interesting for me. I think what folks forget is everyone needs to be trained on medical cannabis, whether they're interested in prescribing it or not, right? I think, you know, education in general always makes a difference. You know, if you choose to not prescribe ultimately or recommend, that's fine. But I think, you know, medical cannabis as a conversation is both not going away, as well as is going to continue to impact medical care moving forward. So, you know, some of the discussions that I'm having with folks, you know, really identifying ways to educate, you know, clinicians across the board to make sure that even if you're not interested, hey, this is something that you need to understand, to know about, be an informed consumer, whether you choose to, you know, recommend it or not. So I think that there's lots and lots of room for growth for sure in that area.
Yeah, I mean, patients are going to ask either way.
Correct.
And
Correct.
so I think doctors need to know how to answer those questions. I mean, they're there to help patients. And as patients go to doctors looking for their expertise. And so I think not even wanting to understand about medical cannabis is a disservice to the patients, especially if you're asking for it.
Agreed.
Let's see. Okay.
These are great comments, by the way, and thanks. It's so nice to have such an engaged group, so thank you.
There's a dispensary manager in New Hampshire. Our biggest issue would be that doctors use the phrase, "we are federally funded," yes, as a reason to not certify individual conditions.
Yes.
Now the patients have to doctor shop instead of using their own physician, who they've been with years. How are we working on changing this so they cannot use that excuse all while prescribing opiates still?
Yeah, I think it's a great comment / question. I think it really is going to be, similar to this webinar. The more legitimacy, the more we keep bringing, issues that this presentation is going to get shared with many, many folks, including folks that do research with federal funds and sort of how best to address, their concerns, but then also to, as we change laws, moving away from that, Schedule I determination, things like that. I think it's just going to take time. But I do think that I always feel like I underestimate how much people know about cannabis, medical cannabis in general, right? Every time you open the conversation, you're like, well, they can't not know this, right? But it always surprises me that, the conversations really have to start quite from the very beginning. So I think just you being out there and having the conversations you have, talking, sharing, really is going to be sort of that collective momentum that's going to sort of tip the scales to have people really get where and how this provides benefit to patients, and it's a viable option for sure.
Yeah, and that, I mean, we get that excuse a lot from patients too, and from doctors when they work for a federally funded. I mean, it's difficult, It doesn't mean that they can't encourage their patients to get educated themselves through cannabis care certification, or to encourage them to look for another doctor, or let them know another doctor that might be certified in the area. As with dispensaries, who is setting standards for qualified specialist physicians? There is one doctor in Western New York who has established himself as the specialist for the region and possibly the state. While his work is good, his interests are limited and limit treatment options for patients. Mm-hmm. That sounds like, I think a lot of people, that sounds very familiar, that situation. That happens in a lot of other states where there's just one doctor who is the only one in the area. In fact, I think last I heard, this was a few weeks ago, maybe 2 months ago, Utah only had one doctor that was recommending in the whole state. So hopefully that's changed by now. But a lot of times there's only one doctor in the area and they're the expert. For setting the standards, I'm not really sure. I don't think there are standards for qualified specialists. That is a major problem. Like I said, you can go to any medical professional who are certifying patients or recommending patients and have no experience or education about medical cannabis at all. So.
Yeah, and unfortunately, I think that's the work we have before us, right? The danger of having one person, although thank you for prescribing, right? But when they become the expert and the only voice, then you're just sort of subject to that person's perspectives and thoughts and beliefs. So yeah, I agree. And I think it is going to just be sort of that growing the collective of folks that really understand, are able to talk about the issues in a clear, non, almost, I don't know, sometimes I get accused of being too passionate in some ways, but the nice thing about the facts or the science is it kind of speaks for itself. So I think really, making sure that we continue to have these trainings and these, opportunities for folks to be educated, I think it always makes a difference.
And someone said, I am a licensed in PA, although it's been inactive for years. I feel like I need to get involved in the politics because they are being very small-minded about what is allowed as a medical condition. This is one of the things that we at ASA have been really working towards to help patients get access. Because even if your state has a medical cannabis program, so many people in that state don't have access because their condition isn't listed, their symptom isn't listed. It's not just about location, but it's about, what qualifying conditions are listed. So what we always recommend and what we try to do is to let states know that if there is a list, which we don't think there should be, we think that doctors should be able to recommend for whatever they feel is important for the patient. And if there is a list, we try to put in a little cachet at the end that says, here's the list of qualified conditions or anything else a doctor seems should be recommended for. So we are like trying, that is a big issue around the country. It's funny because depending on where you are, people think that, access to cannabis is so easy, like, oh, there's like 4 dispensaries in my county alone, but depending on where you are, there's either no dispensaries or the list of qualifying conditions is so tiny. So that is something that we're working about. That's why advocacy is so important. Yeah. That's what we do, is we try to help change those laws and regulations. So I would say, yes, get involved in politics for sure.
And I think people, when you're in the field, it's a lot easier to think that everybody knows about these issues, but I just know, I'm relatively new to the medical cannabis research area. I'd say last 6 to 8 months. But before that, when you hear about a state making cannabis legal for medical purposes, you don't really hear about sort of these restrictive requirements or, last ditch, they have to try or fail other, medications first, so I think, again, people on the outside that don't know or hear about these things all the time really do get a very small slice of exactly what's going on. So, I think it's continuing to have those conversations, and I feel like I'm a broken record. But anyway, with folks that aren't involved at all, I think is super important to remember these really are sort of the early days.
Right. And Teresa Martin asked, she is in Canada, and she asked, is the current model in the US for employees at a dispensary to make recommendations to a patient? Do the doctors provide patients with specifics on what they need for their condition? No, I mean, well, first of all, employees at a dispensary should not be recommending to a patient. They are, but technically they should not be. It happens everywhere. And what works for one person might not work for other person. So so they really shouldn't be making recommendations, but it does happen. And doctors don't provide patients with specifics on what they need for their condition. Usually, literally, it's just, you are allowed to get a medical cannabis card. That's pretty much all a doctor can do. They can't talk about dosage. They can't talk about methods of administration. So it's hard. Patients don't know where to go to find this information. It really is, difficult. Let's see. We only have about 2 minutes left. These are such great questions, and I'm reading all your comments and everything as well.
God. And I know, and I'm trying to read through them, but there are definitely a lot. So
right,
because we have like a minute left. We definitely will take your comments, respond to them in the next, or reflect on them, and make sure that they're incorporated in the next webinar in a week from now. We really just want to thank you for your participation. You guys have been like active listeners. I could tell, like, as I was giving my talk, you guys were right there with me listening and involved as well. And like I said, we'll be sure to make sure that we, address, discuss, talk about a lot of great points you guys are all bringing up.
So we hope that you will join us next week. Same bat channel, same bat time. I think it's.
I know some of you young people might not know the reference, but it was an old. I thought about that as soon as I said it. I was like, oh, I hope. Anyway, an old Batman TV show. Look at it.
Yeah, so I think it'll be the same time next week, and it's going to be more interactive next week. We really want to hear your stories. We really want to hear your experiences. Where those
and feel free to send them to us if you want, like ahead of time, right? I mean, we talked about that too. If you want to send us your stories, I know some of you've actually, taken the time to really sort of craft some of the struggles that you had to deal with in terms of getting access. If you want to forward those to us as well, we can, do what we can ahead of time to compile them. That would be amazing. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. And this webinar will be posted on our YouTube page if you want to share it with other people. I'll just post that right here in case.
Great.
This is where it'll be posted maybe in a day or two. So.
Awesome. And then if you know of folks that have registered the first time around but couldn't make it or whatever, either way, we'll send the link to folks, whether you were able to join. Thank you so much for being here, and also to the folks that weren't able to be here, and feel free to forward the link to whoever you think needs and wants it. Okay, great. It's 3 o'clock. Thanks everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.